Hey everyone, I want to do something a little bit different in this video. I'm not just going to tell you what's going on and say, this is how I understand it. I'm going to lay out a side story, a side plot in this whole Iran-United States saga. And then I want to talk about a couple of different options for how to understand why the Americans are behaving the way they're behaving, because it's not 100% clear to me. And so here's the story. Okay, we're all familiar with the MOU. We're familiar with where we are with the ceasefire. I don't need to go over that. So there's an Israeli journalist named Dror Balazadeh. Dror Balazadeh is on the screen there. And he is generally understood to be one of the best sourced, if not the best sourced reporter in Israel covering the Iranian regime. He has access that reportedly reaches to senior levels inside the Iranian regime. I've been watching him for years, and when he makes a claim, when he reports something, it turns out to be correct. So here's what he laid out the other day. I'm not going to play the clip of him saying it. It was a short clip. It was less than 2 minutes, and it was in Hebrew. And rather than do that or do a voiceover, because it was just him talking for about a minute and a half, I'm going to read you an English translation of his report. Okay, and then after I read it, I'm going to explain what he was saying. So don't worry if you miss one of the details. Here's what he said. The memorandum of understanding between Iran and the United States lifted sanctions on Iran's national oil companies to allow for the renewal of oil exports. However, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, remains designated as a terrorist organization by the US, and the sanctions on them have not been lifted. Now, what's the difference? So Dror went on to say that the IRGC has an independent marketing channel to sell oil, and it's a shadow fleet of oil tankers conducting deals worth billions of dollars. The IRGC does not sell oil directly, but it uses shell companies, intermediaries, and the shadow fleet. This means that even if the sanctions relief doesn't officially apply to the IRGC, it may, meaning the sanctions relief may facilitate the operations of the network of intermediaries and the shadow fleet, allowing them to profit from oil revenues. Currently, between 40 and 50 tankers from this shadow fleet are operating in the Malaysia and China region. This is an unprecedented concentration of Iranian tankers of this type in the region. These are large tankers that are difficult to hide. So there are many on the many of these tankers are on the US Treasury sanctions list and are closely monitored by satellites and maritime intelligence systems. It's hard to believe the US authorities are unaware of this situation. So the central question is, if sanctions on the IRGC and its shadow fleet network are still in effect, why are these tankers operating with no interference? Is this a US decision to avoid enforcement during the period of understanding, or is there another explanation? Washington is projecting a tougher stance towards Iran recently, but this situation raises significant questions about the gap between US policy and actual enforcement. Okay? Let me explain this. So shadow fleets are these ships that they carry like the flags of different countries. Sometimes they switch them. They're designed to avoid sanctions. And I made a video about this way back about how the shadow fleets work, that they'll take Iranian oil on a ship that doesn't have an Iranian flag on it, and it'll travel all over the place. It won't take a direct route. And this is where Venezuela was very much part of the Iranian system. They would ship the oil all the way up to Venezuela, or it'll meet another ship out in the middle of the sea, and they'll trade oil, and they'll mix the oil together, and they'll change the flags on the ship. And it's all a way of trying to avoid sanctions. Now, the way that sanctions work is that the particular ships are being tracked. The ships' identities are being tracked by the Americans. So ships are sanctioned. They know which ships are part of the Iranian shadow fleet, or confirmed to have been part of the Iranian shadow fleet. So that's the shadow fleet of the IRGC. Okay, now you might be thinking, it's the same regime. It's the same gang of criminals. Who cares whether the official Iranian oil industry is selling the oil or if the IRGC's shadow fleet is selling oil? Who cares which the department, who cares which department the money runs through? That's what you might be asking. But this actually matters a lot. And let me explain why. So when Washington eases the sanctions on Iran's national oil companies, and that's clause 10 of the Memorandum of Understanding, easing the sanctions on Iran's oil companies, it's easing sanctions on the Iranian state. Okay, that means that's the government that technically has to answer for whatever it's signed onto in the ceasefire. The United States is not signing a deal with the IRGC. It's with the Iranian state. And it runs through recognized channels. And that means that money that goes to the Iranian state when they sell oil is basically trackable and accountable. The IRGC is a different animal. They are a foreign terrorist organization. They're not just a branch of the Iranian military. The money of the IRGC does not flow into the same treasury that pays for roads and electricity and has whatever checks and balance. I mean, there's not so many checks, but it doesn't flow into the Iranian national treasury. And a large share of the money that goes to the IRGC funds the IRGC's own operations. And one of those operations, maybe the main one, is what's called the Quds Force. The Quds Force is the branch of the IRGC that funds and arms all of the proxies, the Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. So when the IRGC sells a barrel of oil through a shadow tanker in the shadow fleet, that's not the same as the Iranian government selling oil. Okay, because the revenue from the shadow fleet ends up being kind of like this dark money, goes into the IRGC, and then they're using it for all sorts of illicit activity and funding proxies and etc. And in other words, the revenue heads into the network of the IRGC. That's still sanctioned. That's not, the US did not lift sanctions on the IRGC. So when the US drew this line in the MOU that they're lifting the sanctions on Iran's oil industry, but they never lifted the sanctions on the IRGC, that's not just, it's not just bureaucratic hair splitting. It actually matters. In other words, they want to I still disagree with this, but the Trump administration is saying, okay, we're going to allow the Iranian economy to breathe a little bit, but we're not going to allow money to go to the IRGC. The IRGC is still sanctioned. So what Dror is reporting here is that the IRGC shadow fleet has about 40 to 50 tankers in the Malaysia-China area. And it's moving, and no one is interdicting them, and no one is doing anything about it. No one's enforcing it, and it's out in the open. So the terror financing side of the regime is selling oil right now, is taking advantage of the lifting of the blockade. Iranian oil's coming out. It's going into the shadow fleet, and they're selling their oil. Okay, so that's what he's reporting on, and he's asking himself at the end of his story. You saw he asked there. It raises questions about the gap between U.S. policy and actual enforcement. Is this a U.S. decision to avoid enforcement during the period of the MOU, or is there another explanation? That's the question that Dror raised there. So Dror adds. What he adds in there is that the IRGC never sold oil directly in the first place. They've always used the workaround of the shadow fleet because they've been under sanctions forever and ever. So that's how the IRGC sells oil. I hope I explained the shadow fleet well enough. And as Dror said, a concentration of 40 to 50 tankers clustered off of the near Malaysia and China is unprecedented. These are not small boats. And many of these boats are on the U.S. Treasury sanctions list. Remember, on the sanctions list, it lists the names and serial numbers of certain vessels. And those vessels are then tracked by satellite. So what Dror is saying is that the U.S. knows about this. They know that there are these tankers near Malaysia and China. They know that they're part of the IRGC shadow fleet. They know that they're moving oil. We can all see it. Why are they not doing anything about it? That's Dror's question. Sorry, just had to cough. Okay. Now, before we get into the why, one more thing, because it tells you how shaky this whole MOU really is. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said this week that only China is buying Iranian oil and that other countries have been wary. Right? No country besides China is actually buying discounted Iranian oil. Everyone else is staying away because they think the sanctions could snap back and they don't want to get caught holding sanctioned cargo when that happens. So even though the sanctions have been listed, they're selling oil only to China. Now, China still has always bought the vast majority of Iranian oil. So Iran is making money, but Bessent was pointing this out. So, and the reason that matters for this story, why does that matter for this story? That no one else is buying the Iranian oil because they're worried about the sanctions snapping back, is that the market is telling you that the market doesn't care about geopolitics. The market cares about risk. And what this tells you is that the market is behaving like this deal could fall apart any day. Okay? Hope that makes sense. Now, let's reason through why the U.S. is not doing anything about these tankers. Okay, that's the question I really want to deal with here. So there's two honest explanations that I could think of for why this visible, trackable shadow fleet is sailing around basically untouched. So let's lay them out. Option number one is that the U.S. is intentionally doing this. They're letting it go because they are saving this piece of leverage. They're saving this chip to possibly play it down the road. So think about it this way from Washington's side. You just signed this 60-day MOU ceasefire thing, and it's very fragile. Your top priority isn't hunting down every single sanctions violation and going no, and shaking your finger at every single sanctions violation, because the Americans want to keep the process alive long enough to lock down the thing that they actually care about, which is the nuclear file. And that's the big prize where Trump can say, you see, I accomplished it. The whole goal is that Iran should never have a nuclear weapon. And that's the thing he really cares about. So he doesn't want to blow it up. With this, he wants to keep the process going. And so if you start seizing tankers, IRGC tankers 2 weeks into this MOU thing, then the Iranian hardliners are going to dig in. The IRGC are the hardliners anyway. They're going to start digging in and say, oh, look, the Americans never, are still being belligerent. And you don't want the Americans don't want the hardliners to dig in now and torpedo progress on the deal. Again, I'm not justifying this. I'm talking about what the possible thinking is on the American side. So the Americans decide to sit on their hands and not do anything about this. And they're saving the enforcement on the shadow fleets as a card to possibly play later, maybe timed with when the MOU really blows up, or to force Iran's hand at some point. But why play the card now? Maybe there's a better time to play it later. Right. And we see that the Americans are talking tough. Even J.D. Vance talking about, we've destroyed everything and the U.S. holds the stronger hand, and that the road ahead is either a deal with permanent inspections or we're going to resort to force again. And even J.D. Vance, who looks like the most dovish, is still also talking tough. So it's possible that the administration is holding on to this as another lever they can pull to tighten the screws later when they want to get tougher on Iran. And right now they don't want to get tough. They don't want to get tough yet. Now, if this is right, so we should probably expect there to be some enforcement on the shadow fleet coming as things deteriorate with the MOU, or as we get to the end of the 60 days, if Trump doesn't want to renew it, meaning at some point we should see out of the blue, we should see enforcement on this shadow fleet, because it's not going away. They're going to keep doing it. Okay. Option 2 is the bad option, that the Americans just are turning a blind eye to it because they're just done fighting. Right? Under this read, the American silence on the shadow fleet is a tell. It's what it means that no one in Washington wants to go back to war, and they're just going to turn a blind eye to it. They don't want to raise gas prices. So the fact that there's, that it's illicit gas and it's out there, if there's more oil out there, I'm sorry, not gas, oil. If there's more oil out there and it keeps global supply lower, okay, we'll turn a blind eye to it. And there's no stomach in the White House for another round of kinetic action, and we don't want to blow it up. If that's true, then Iran's behavior makes perfect sense, right? They're just going to exploit this. They're going to exploit the Americans' timidity. They're going to stall the nuclear talks. They're going to send junior officials to Doha to negotiate instead of anyone who can actually sign something. They're going to demand their frozen money up front instead of earning it by doing something. And then just keep the IRGC's tanker network running exactly like before, because the Americans aren't enforcing it and there's no real cost. Washington isn't going to blow up the ceasefire over tankers when it's not even sure it wants the confrontation the ceasefire was supposed to settle. Right? If you look at it this way, then all the tough talk from the Americans, including Vance, is exactly what it sounds like, just tough talk. So if this option is right, then instead of enforcement coming down the road as things unravel, meaning again, according to option 1, as the Iranians play games in the negotiations or during the 60 days or whatever it is with the MOU, then the Americans can use this as an enforcement they can even do now without blowing up the deal. Maybe they're saving it for that. Or if option 2 is correct, they're just not going to enforce it. And that's going to go along with the 60 days turning into 75 days or 90 days or 120 days or whatever, because, and that's what the Iranians are hoping for, because, they're always buying time. And if they see that the Americans really, really, really don't want to go back to war, which is, I think, what's happening, they're just going to try to kick it down the road and make this 60 days turn into more, because every day that it goes on, they're selling oil. And now we know with this, the IRGC is also selling oil. They're getting funding into their proxy network. They're getting funding into the regime. So those are the two options. Are the Americans being timid and capitulating and turning a blind eye to something they should be enforcing, or are they saving it for later? Or maybe it's a combination of both. Anyway, look, either way, the reason this exercise is useful is because we're making ourselves smarter for what to expect downrange. So the MOU was signed on June 17th. 60 days puts us at mid-August, if it's the original 60 days only. If the shadow fleet if enforcement on the shadow fleet happens before then or around then that looks more like option 1. That it was being used as leverage the whole time. Meaning if Iran continues to misbehave in the Strait of Hormuz and to drive a hard bargain about moving forward, and we don't see any enforcement on the shadow fleet, then it looks like the Americans backing down. It looks like option 2. If enforcement on the shadow fleet, which they can also do now without violating the MOU, if that happens already before mid-August, then it's more like option 1, that they're using it as a piece of leverage. That's what I'm thinking here, because again, Dror Balazadeh doesn't answer the question why. He poses that a question at the end of his reporting. He said, like, here's the question: what is America doing? What's the explanation? Either way, this is not a good situation. The IRGC, literally Hezbollah, Houthis, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Iraqi militias. That apparatus is selling oil now. Lots of tankers. Anyway, so this is just an exercise to try to give us something to anticipate coming down range. I hope this was useful. Please let me know what you thought of this video. And please subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and tell other people about what we're doing on this channel. Share these videos with people you think are interested, people who follow the Middle East. Share a video of mine, and please keep spreading the word. I'm really grateful to everyone for helping grow the channel. It's really been a great blessing. All right, God bless. Bye-bye.